Rain hammers against the windows of the Boston Police Department's 14th precinct on a bitter November night, the kind that makes even hardened New Englanders seek shelter. Two police officers, Sullivan and Martinez, lead a stumbling woman in a soaked burgundy cocktail dress through the precinct doors, her Christian Louboutin heels dragging across the worn linoleum floor. Her expensive makeup runs down her cheeks in dark rivulets, giving her the appearance of a tragic theater mask. The woman, who identifies herself as Elena Reyes according to her fake ID, sways precariously between the officers, her designer clutch hanging limply from her manicured fingers. "Another rough night at the Black Rose, sweetheart?" Officer Sullivan chuckles, steadying her as she trips over her own feet. The smell of expensive scotch emanates from her, but there's something else beneath it, a subtle floral perfume that seems oddly familiar to Martinez. Elena responds to Sullivan's taunt by violently vomiting, the contents of her stomach barely missing his polished shoes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The booking process is a mess of smeared fingerprints and slurred responses, ending with them half carrying her to a holding cell where she collapses onto a cold bench, seemingly passing out instantly. Through barely open eyes, Elena watches the ancient clock on the wall tick toward midnight, its rhythmic movement matching her carefully measured breathing. The fluorescent lights flicker above her, each flash triggering memories of another life, another time, when she was someone else entirely. Her mind drifts back 20 years to a snow-covered Moscow apartment, where another clock ticked away the final moments of her childhood. 12-year-old Elena sat across from her father at an antique chess table, its marble surface reflecting the warm lamplight that cast long shadows across the room. Mikhail Petrov, a former KGB operative who had reinvented himself as an international chess champion, studied his daughter's moves with pride in his steel-gray eyes. "Remember, moya zvezda," he said in Russian, his deep voice warm with affection despite the tension in his shoulders. "In chess, as in life, the winner isn't always the one with the most pieces." He moved his bishop across the board with deliberate grace, setting up a complex endgame that Elena was still learning to master. Sometimes victory belongs to the one willing to sacrifice everything. His words carried a weight she wouldn't understand until moments later, when their world exploded into violence. The apartment door burst inward with a deafening crack, splintering off its hinges as three men in black tactical gear stormed through. Their boots crunched on broken glass and wood, the double-headed eagle patch of the FSB visible on their shoulders. Mikhail moved with a speed that betrayed his chess champion facade, flipping the heavy marble table for cover and pulling Elena behind him as 7.62mm rounds tore through the antique wood. The chess pieces scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers, some shattering against the walls. He pressed something cold into her hand, the white queen, and whispered urgently about its importance before pushing her toward a hidden panel in the wall, a remnant of Soviet-era paranoia that would save her life. Elena crawled inside the narrow space, clutching the chess piece so tightly its edges bit into her palm. Through gaps in the panel's wooden slats, she watched in horror as her father revealed his true nature. Mikhail moved like a dancer of death, his movements precise and lethal. He disarmed the first agent with a move she'd seen him practice in their basement, snapping the man's neck before using his body as a shield. The second agent fell to his own knife, but the third put 3 rounds into Mikhail's chest, the gunshots echoing like thunderclaps in the confined space. Colonel Viktor Rostov stepped through the chaos, his polished shoes leaving bloody footprints on the Persian carpet Elena's mother had loved so much. The FSB team leader's cold eyes surveyed the apartment as Mikhail lay bleeding, his breath coming in wet gasps. "Where is it, Petrov?" Rostov demanded, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to getting answers. "Where's the list? Give it to us, and your daughter might live to see morning." Mikhail's only response was a defiant smile and a blood-stained checkmate before Rostov ended his life with a final bullet to the head. Elena bit down on her fist until she tasted blood, forcing herself to remain silent as tears streamed down her face. She stayed perfectly still for hours as they tore the apartment apart, the chess piece clutched to her chest like a talisman. Only after they left, Taking her father's body with them, did she dare to examine the White Queen. The bottom unscrewed with 3 careful turns, revealing a tiny microchip nestled inside, her father's last gift, and his death sentence. Something crystallized inside Elena at that moment. The girl who played chess with her father died in that hidden panel, replaced by something harder, colder, more dangerous. Now, 20 years later in the Boston holding cell, Elena's eyes snap open at exactly midnight. The sound of a steel door creaking open echoes down the hall, followed by heavy footsteps. Her drunk performance had been flawless. Every stumble, every slurred word, every smeared fingerprint carefully choreographed for this moment. Just as her father taught her over that final game of chess, sometimes victory requires the ultimate sacrifice. Tonight, Elena was prepared to sacrifice everything to complete her mission, starting with the man being led down the corridor in rattling chains. The heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor belonged to 2 corrections officers escorting a high-profile prisoner, their shadows stretching across the dimly lit hallway like dark specters. Elena remains motionless on the holding cell bench, her body language suggesting complete intoxication, while her mind calculates every variable. Through the thin cotton of her dress, she can feel the specialized lockpick woven into the fabric seam, positioned precisely where no pat-down would detect it. The guards pass her cell without a second glance. After all, she's just another drunk waiting to sleep it off. 20 years ago, on that snowy Moscow morning, young Elena had learned her first lesson in survival. After emerging from the hidden panel in her father's blood-stained apartment, she'd made her way through the city's labyrinthine back alleys, her father's oversized coat dragging in the snow. The White Queen chess piece containing its precious microchip remained clutched in her frozen fingers as FSB vehicles screamed past, their sirens cutting through the pre-dawn silence. She remembered her father's words about sacrifice as she forced herself to walk, not run, even when heavy boots crunched in the snow behind her. The city had been locked down within hours, every train station and airport crawling with FSB agents showing her photograph. Elena had found temporary shelter in the basement of an abandoned Soviet-era factory, huddled among rusting machinery as she examined the microchip more closely. The tiny device contained what appeared to be a list of deep-cover FSB agents embedded in various international organizations, sleeper agents waiting to be activated. Her father had discovered their existence while working as a chess instructor for high-ranking intelligence officials, and his conscience wouldn't let him keep their secret. Back in the present, Elena's keen ears pick up the sound of the prisoner being secured in the high-security holding area, 2 corridors away. The Boston Police Department's aging infrastructure works to her advantage. The building's dated electrical system is far more vulnerable than modern facilities. She quietly retrieves a thin wire from her elaborately styled hair, the end stripped to expose its conductive core. Years of training have taught her that the most effective tools are often the simplest. In Moscow, young Elena had survived those first crucial days by remembering her father's chess lessons. Every piece has its purpose, he would say. Even a pawn can change the game. She'd used her small size to her advantage, slipping through drainage tunnels and maintenance shafts as FSB search parties combed the streets above. The city's underground network became her board, and she learned to move through it like a queen through enemy lines. Elena counts her breaths as she works the lockpick into her cell's ancient mechanism. The holding area's cameras run on a 40-second sweep pattern. She's timed them precisely during her drunk entrance. Between sweeps, she slides the thin wire through a gap in the cell's light fixture, creating a connection that will trigger a localized surge when the time comes. The trick isn't escaping the cell. It's ensuring no one realizes she was ever truly confined by it. Just as young Elena had discovered in Moscow, survival often depends more on patience than speed. She had waited 3 full days in that factory basement, subsisting on stale bread from a nearby dumpster, before making her move. The FSB's search patterns had become predictable, their shifts changing at precise intervals. During one such shift change, she'd slipped aboard a delivery truck bound for St. Petersburg, hiding among crates of machine parts. The driver never knew he was carrying precious cargo, both a terrified young girl and a microchip that could shake the foundations of Russian intelligence. The present-day Elena feels sweat beating on her neck as midnight approaches. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wire in the light fixture is perfectly positioned, ready to create a strategic blackout. She recalls how her father would spend hours teaching her about timing in chess. The perfect move at the wrong moment becomes the wrong move. The same principle applies to her current situation. Every element must align perfectly. The guard rotations, the camera sweeps, the prisoner's location, and most importantly, the building's ancient electrical system. In St. Petersburg, young Elena had found temporary sanctuary with her father's chess mentor, an aging grandmaster who recognized the danger she was in. He'd arranged her passage to America through a network of former Soviet dissidents, each move carefully planned like an elaborate chess combination. The microchip remained hidden in the White Queen, which she carried as a seemingly innocent keepsake of her father. Now, as the clock inches closer to midnight, Elena makes her final preparations. She spent months orchestrating this moment, ensuring every detail aligns perfectly. The drunk act was calculated to get her into this specific cell on this specific night, with this specific prisoner mere yards away. Like her father taught her over countless chess games, sometimes you have to sacrifice a piece to control the board. Tonight's operation would require sacrificing her carefully constructed cover identity, but the end game would be worth it. The White Queen chess piece that young Elena smuggled to America contained more than just a list of FSB sleeper agents. It held the key to understanding why Colonel Viktor Rostov had turned her world to ashes that snowy Moscow night. As she lay on the holding cell bench in the Boston precinct, Elena's mind drifted to the day she finally decoded her father's last gift, 6 months after arriving in America. The aging chess grandmaster who had helped her escape Russia had also given her a crucial piece of information. Her father hadn't simply stumbled upon the sleeper agents' identities. He had been their handler. Mikhail Petrov's role as an international chess champion had been the perfect cover for coordinating Russia's deep cover operatives. He would travel to tournaments worldwide, his reputation opening doors to the highest levels of society. The chess matches themselves became a sophisticated code. Specific opening moves, deliberate mistakes, and carefully chosen endgame positions all conveyed messages to agents embedded in various organizations. For 15 years he had orchestrated this elaborate dance of pawns and queens until something changed. 3 weeks before his death, Mikhail had discovered that Rostov planned to activate the sleeper network for an operation codenamed Black Bishop, a coordinated strike designed to assassinate key political figures across Europe and destabilize the Western Alliance. The collateral damage would be catastrophic, with countless innocent lives sacrificed in the ensuing chaos. Mikhail, who had lost his wife to a terrorist bombing years earlier, couldn't bear the thought of inflicting such pain on other families. His conscience, long dormant under layers of patriotic duty, finally awoke. Elena remembered the subtle changes in her father's behavior during those final weeks, the late-night phone calls, the encrypted messages hidden in online chess forums, the mysterious meetings with old contacts. He had been preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Rostov, knowing that his betrayal would carry a death sentence. But Mikhail Petrov had been playing chess since before Elena was born, and he knew how to think several moves ahead. The microchip contained more than just the sleeper agents' identities. It held detailed evidence of Rostov's operation, including financial transactions, communication protocols, and the complete timeline for Black Bishop. Most crucially, it contained proof that Rostov had been selling information to private interests, using the sleeper network for personal profit under the guise of state security. This was Mikhail's insurance policy, his way of ensuring that even in death he could protect his daughter and expose Rostov's corruption. In America, Elena had found an unlikely ally in former CIA operative Sarah Matthews, who had once worked alongside Mikhail during a joint operation in Berlin. Sarah recognized the significance of the information on the microchip and understood the danger Elena faced. Instead of turning the teenager over to U.S. intelligence agencies, Sarah had chosen to protect her, becoming both mentor and surrogate mother. Under Sarah's guidance, Elena learned not just the tools of espionage, but the importance of maintaining her humanity in a world of shadows. Sarah had connections to a secretive organization known as the Archive, a network of former intelligence operatives who had become disillusioned with their agency's methods. They operated independently, working to prevent catastrophic events while avoiding the political entanglements that often paralyzed official channels. The Archive saw the potential in Elena, not just as a source of intelligence on Russian operations, but as someone who could be shaped into a formidable operative. For years, Elena trained under various Archive members, each contributing to her education in different ways. A former Mossad agent taught her the art of disguise and infiltration. An ex-MI6 operative specialized in electronic warfare showed her how to manipulate security systems. A retired Special Forces instructor honed her physical abilities. But perhaps most importantly, a chess grandmaster who had once played against her father taught her to apply the strategic principles of chess to real-world operations. The Archive had also helped Elena establish multiple cover identities, each carefully crafted to withstand scrutiny. Her current persona, as Elena Reyes, a wealthy socialite with a drinking problem, had taken 3 years to build. Every public intoxication incident, every tabloid photograph, every carefully orchestrated scandal contributed to a profile that would make tonight's drunk act completely believable to the Boston police. But as Elena lay in her cell, listening to the guards' movements and timing the camera sweeps, she knew that her father's ghost still haunted every operation. Rostov had survived the initial exposure of Black Bishop, using his political connections to weather the storm while many of his subordinates took the fall. He had emerged even stronger, rising through the ranks to become one of the FSB's most powerful directors. The man being held in the high-security area tonight, the target Elena had spent months maneuvering into position, was one of Rostov's most trusted lieutenants, and he carried information that could finally bring down the colonel who had murdered her father. The last traces of Sarah Matthews's training echoed in Elena's mind as she executed her plan in the Boston precinct. Sarah had always emphasized that the best operations were like perfectly played chess games, each move setting up 3 others with contingencies built into every action. The electrical surge Elena had engineered wouldn't just disable the cameras, it would trigger the precinct's automated systems to unlock all secure doors momentarily, a fail-safe designed to prevent prisoners from being trapped during emergencies. She had discovered this vulnerability during 3 months of carefully planned, drunk and disorderly arrests in different precincts across Boston, each one a rehearsal for tonight. The clock struck midnight, and Elena's makeshift circuit completed its work. The holding area plunged into darkness as emergency generators struggled to compensate for the surge. In the confusion, Elena moved with practiced precision, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She had deliberately broken one of her heels during her drunken entrance, knowing shoes would only slow her down. The guards' shouts and radio chatter provided perfect cover for the soft click of her cell door opening. Sarah's first lesson had been about transitions, those crucial moments when an operative moved from one phase of a mission to another. Those are the moments when everything can fall apart, she had told Elena during one of their training sessions in a remote cabin in Montana. Your mind wants to rush ahead to the next phase, but you have to stay completely present in the transition. Elena remembered those words as she glided through the darkened corridor, every step measured, every breath controlled. The Archive had provided Elena with detailed blueprints of the precinct, but more importantly, they had given her access to years of incident reports and security assessments. She knew that the backup generators would restore partial power within 40 seconds, creating a strobe-like effect as the ancient electrical system struggled to stabilize. This intermittent lighting would work to her advantage, making her movements appear jerky and discontinuous to any observers, a technique she had learned from a former Mossad operative who specialized in exploiting human visual perception. Through the darkness, Elena moved past the booking area where she had performed her drunk act just hours earlier. Officer Sullivan was still there, now frantically trying to coordinate with other units over a failing radio system. Elena allowed herself a small smile, remembering how his casual condescension had almost made her break character. The Archive had taught her to use people's prejudices against them, A drunk woman in designer clothes was practically invisible in a police station, dismissed as just another rich party girl who had overindulged. As she approached the high-security holding area, Elena activated her second prepared disruption. The thin wire she had used to trigger the power surge had also introduced a subtle malfunction in the building's fire suppression system. Right on schedule, the sprinklers activated, adding to the chaos. Water rained down on the already confused officers, shorting out more electronics and forcing them to deal with multiple system failures simultaneously. The lessons went beyond physical combat and tradecraft. Sarah insisted that Elena maintain her piano playing, not just as a potential cover skill, but as a way to preserve some part of her humanity. The most dangerous operatives, she would say during their evening debriefings, are the ones who forget they're human. The music became Elena's anchor, a reminder of who she was beneath the layers of carefully constructed identities. Perhaps the most valuable lesson Sarah imparted was the importance of patience. When Elena had first arrived at the cabin, she was consumed by the desire for immediate revenge against Rostov. Sarah had channeled that raw anger into something more controlled, more precise. "Revenge is like poison," she had explained one night over tea. "Drink it too quickly and it kills you. Sip it slowly, build up an immunity, and it becomes a tool." The transformation hadn't been easy. There were nights when Elena would wake up screaming, reliving the moment of her father's death. Sarah would sit with her until dawn, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of her own losses in the field. These moments of vulnerability, far from weakening their training relationship, had strengthened it. Elena learned that true strength wasn't about being emotionless, but about channeling emotions precisely. Their final training exercise had been both a test and a revelation. Sarah had arranged a complex scenario involving a local corrupt official, requiring Elena to gather intelligence, establish a cover, and execute a non-lethal extraction. What Elena hadn't known was that the entire situation was fabricated. The official was an archive operative, the evidence was manufactured, and every person involved was part of the test. When she successfully completed the mission without taking a single life, Sarah had finally deemed her ready. "Remember," Sarah had said on Elena's last night at the cabin, "your father played chess at the grandmaster level, not because he was good at taking pieces, but because he understood the value of keeping them on the board. Sometimes the pieces you don't take are more important than the ones you do." The transformation of Elena Petrov into Elena Reyes had been a masterwork of identity crafting that took nearly 2 years to perfect. The woman who stumbled into the Black Rose, Boston's most exclusive nightclub, at 9:47 p.m., was unrecognizable from the girl who had escaped Moscow with a chess piece and a death sentence. Her Valentino dress, deliberately chosen to draw attention while remaining forgettable, caught the light perfectly as she made her calculated entrance. The maitre d' recognized her immediately, not because he knew her true identity, but because Elena Reyes had become a regular fixture in Boston's high society over the past 18 months. The archive had helped her construct the perfect cover. A wealthy venture capitalist's troubled daughter, whose public intoxication incidents were regular enough to be expected, but not so frequent as to draw serious concern. Tonight's performance at the Black Rose had been choreographed down to the smallest detail. Elena had spent weeks establishing her drinking patterns at the club, making sure the staff would remember her preference for expensive scotch and her tendency to get emotional after her 4th drink. As she settled at her usual corner table, Elena's trained eyes swept the room while appearing to focus dreamily on her phone. The club's security cameras covered every angle except for a small blind spot near the emergency exit, a flaw she had discovered during her 3rd visit. The regular Thursday night bartender, Marcus, already had her usual drink ready. She had carefully cultivated a relationship with him over months, sharing just enough personal details to make her seem like any other lonely socialite seeking connection over expensive liquor. "Rough day at the office?" Marcus asked, playing his part in their weekly ritual. Elena let her perfectly manicured fingers tremble slightly as she reached for the glass, showing the first signs of what would become her dramatic downward spiral over the next 2 hours. Her response was calculated to reinforce her cover story. Something about her father cutting off her startup funding, delivered with just the right mix of entitlement and vulnerability. The scotch never touched her lips. Elena had mastered the art of appearing to drink while actually disposing of the alcohol through various subtle methods. Tonight, most of it would end up in the planter beside her table, the soil already stained dark from previous performances. By 11:30 p.m., she had established herself as visibly intoxicated, her words slurring just enough to concern the staff but not enough to have them call for help. The timing had to be perfect. At precisely 11:42 p.m., Elena stumbled toward the ladies' room, deliberately bumping into a businessman's table and causing a scene. The subsequent argument was loud enough to draw the attention of the club's security, who would later remember her as being belligerently drunk. When she got behind the wheel of her Mercedes at 11:47 p.m., the valet's concerned expression told her that her act was working perfectly. 3 blocks from the club, Elena made sure to swerve just enough to catch the attention of the police cruiser she knew would be patrolling the area. Officers Sullivan and Martinez were exactly the type of cops she had anticipated. Experienced enough to handle a drunk driving incident professionally, but not so experienced that they would look too deeply into her background. Their patrol route had been part of her research, their personalities studied through weeks of observation. The field sobriety test was a masterpiece of controlled failure. Elena swayed and stumbled with the precision of a dancer, her movements choreographed to appear naturally uncoordinated. When she vomited during her booking, it wasn't from alcohol, but from a carefully timed capsule of ipecac she had palmed earlier. The tears that streaked her mascara were induced by a nearly invisible dab of chemical irritant beneath her eyes. Another trick learned during her training. Everything about Elena Reyes was designed to be simultaneously memorable and forgettable. Her designer clothes were last season's styles, expensive enough to establish her status but not unique enough to stand out. Her accent was a carefully crafted blend of American private school and hints of her native Russian, softened by years of supposed California living. Even her fingerprints, carefully obscured by a thin film of surgical-grade adhesive, would match the identity she had created. As she lay on the holding cell bench, Elena allowed herself a moment of professional pride. The drunk socialite act was merely the opening move in a much larger game, one that had taken years to set up. Kozlov's presence in the high-security area was no coincidence. His arrest had been orchestrated through months of carefully planted evidence and anonymous tips. Like her father had taught her over countless chess games, sometimes you had to sacrifice a pawn to draw out the queen. In the darkness of the holding area, Elena moved with the fluid precision that came from thousands of hours of training. The chaos she had engineered, the power surge, the sprinkler system, the confusion among the officers, provided the perfect cover for what came next. Kozlov's medical emergency would need to appear entirely natural, especially given the inevitable investigation that would follow. Sarah's voice echoed in her mind. The best operations are the ones that look like they were never operations at all. Water from the sprinklers had soaked through her designer dress, but the discomfort was irrelevant. Elena had spent 3 weeks during her training submerged in near-freezing Montana lakes, learning to operate while physically compromised. The archive's physical conditioning program had been specifically designed to eliminate any instinctive reactions to environmental stressors. Even now, with cold water running down her spine and her wet hair clinging to her face, her heart rate remained steady at exactly 64 beats per minute, the optimal rhythm for fine motor control under stress. As she approached Kozlov's cell, her hands remained perfectly steady despite the cold. The specialized lockpick, disguised as a common hairpin, had been crafted by the archive's technical division using a titanium ceramic composite that could bypass most standard security measures while appearing innocuous to metal detectors. The lock mechanism yielded to her expertise in exactly 2.3 seconds. Any faster would have indicated suspicious expertise. Any slower risked detection. Kozlov recognized her immediately, not as Elena Petrov, but as someone else from his past. The girl from Kiev, he muttered in Russian, his eyes widening with belated understanding. 6 months ago, Elena had orchestrated a seemingly chance encounter with him at a weapons deal in Ukraine, playing the role of a naive courier. That meeting had been designed specifically for this moment, to make him hesitate just long enough for her to close the distance. The archive had spent weeks constructing that particular cover identity, complete with verifiable references and a digital footprint that would withstand scrutiny. The syringe she pulled from her hair appeared to be a standard epinephrine auto-injector, the kind that medical responders would expect to find on someone having an emergency. In reality, it contained a sophisticated compound developed by the archive's chemical division, code-named Morpheus Protocol. The drug would trigger symptoms identical to a severe cardiac event, one that would appear completely natural given Kozlov's documented history of heart problems. A medical record Elena had carefully fabricated over the previous year through strategic placements of data in various healthcare databases across 3 countries. Elena maintained perfect awareness of her surroundings as she administered the injection, her senses heightened by years of situational awareness training. The guards' footsteps and radio chatter told her exactly where they were in the building. 2 teams on the floor above, one moving toward the western stairwell, another checking the electrical room. The strobing emergency lights created predictable patterns of shadow and illumination that she used to time her movements, each flash providing a fraction of a second of visibility that she had learned to exploit. The angle of Kozlov's fall was calculated with mathematical precision. The position of his body would support the narrative of a man clutching his chest before collapsing. Elena had studied hundreds of cardiac arrest cases, learning the exact way victims typically fell, where their hands clutched, how their legs buckled. Even the pattern of water from the sprinklers on his clothes had to be consistent with someone who had collapsed naturally, rather than being positioned. The compound wasn't just about eliminating Kozlov, it was a masterpiece of biochemical engineering. The primary agent would trigger a cascade of natural biological responses that would fool even the most sophisticated autopsy techniques. The secondary agent was designed to interact with the cocktail of drugs already in his system. Medications that Elena had ensured were documented in his booking report, through careful manipulation of his recent medical visits. This interaction would create specific markers in his bloodstream, ones that would lead investigators toward a predetermined conclusion about the cause of death. The archive's forensics experts had tested this method extensively across different genetic profiles and medical conditions, ensuring it would withstand even the most rigorous examination. Elena had exactly 47 seconds before the compound would take full effect, a window so precise it had been calibrated to Kozlov's exact body mass and metabolic rate. In that time, she needed to extract the real target of this operation, a subcutaneous data chip implanted in Kozlov's left forearm. The incision was made with a ceramic blade engineered to match the microscopic tear patterns of human fingernails, ensuring it would leave marks consistent with him scratching himself during a cardiac episode. The chip, no larger than a grain of rice, contained encrypted files detailing Rostov's entire North American network. David Chen walked into his apartment at 2 a.m. to find Elena curled up in his reading chair, still wearing her wet cocktail dress. As a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, he wasn't used to such late-night surprises, but Elena had a way of making the unusual seem natural. She had a key to his place, had for months now, though she rarely used it. Tonight was different. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, and to anyone else, she would have looked like she'd had too much to drink at the Black Rose. David knew better. Their relationship had begun 8 months ago at a gallery opening. Elena had been examining a restored Degas, and her commentary on the brushwork had caught David's attention. What started as a professional discussion about art restoration techniques had evolved into coffee, then dinner, then something deeper that neither of them had planned for. David thought he was dating Elena Reyes, the venture capitalist's daughter with a passion for art and a complicated relationship with alcohol. The truth was far more complex. "You look like you could use some tea," David said, moving to the kitchen without turning on the lights. He knew she preferred the darkness sometimes, especially on nights like this. The kettle's soft whistle and the gentle clink of ceramic cups filled the silence between them. Elena watched him prepare her favorite oolong with precise movements, noting how he remembered exactly how she took it. No sugar, just a hint of honey steeped for exactly 3 minutes. "The museum's hosting a new exhibition next month," David continued, setting her cup down on the side table. Russian Impressionists. I thought of you when I saw the catalog. Elena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the tea, a genuine reaction that surprised her. The archive had trained her to control every micro-expression, every involuntary movement, but something about David made her defenses slip. Their conversations often danced around the edges of her past. She had constructed a careful narrative about growing up in California, complete with verifiable details about schools she'd never attended and a family that didn't exist. But David had a way of asking questions that made her want to tell the truth. About Moscow, about her father, about the chess pieces that still haunted her dreams. I had another episode at the club, she said, using their code for her supposed drinking problems. David moved to sit across from her, concern evident in his features. He never judged, never pushed her to get help, just offered quiet support and a safe space. It made lying to him increasingly difficult. Elena had been trained to handle intimate relationships as part of her cover. The archive had entire protocols for managing personal connections without compromising operations. But David was different. He noticed things others missed. How she always sat facing the door in restaurants, how her eyes tracked movement patterns in crowds, how she sometimes slipped into perfect Russian pronunciation when discussing certain artists. You know you can stay here, he offered as he always did. The guest room is yours. But Elena never stayed until morning. She couldn't risk letting him see her nightmares, couldn't bear the thought of potentially saying something in her sleep that would put him in danger. The archive had warned her about emotional attachments, about the vulnerability they created. David reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. Elena forced herself not to flinch, not to react with the defensive techniques ingrained by years of training. His touch was gentle, caring, everything her world of shadows and violence was not. For a moment she allowed herself to lean into his hand, to imagine a life where Elena Reyes was real, where her biggest concern really was her father's disapproval of her career choices. There's an opening at the Gardener next week, David said, changing the subject with his usual sensitivity. They're showcasing some newly discovered chess pieces from the Byzantine era. I thought maybe we could go together. The irony almost made Elena laugh. Even when trying to escape her past, it found ways to surface. But the invitation created a new problem. Elena knew that Rostov's network had connections to the art world, using galleries and exhibitions as covers for their operations. The Gardener opening would be crawling with potential hostile surveillance. Going with David would risk exposing him to that world, would make him a potential target if anyone made the connection between them. Yet looking at him now, patiently waiting for her response, Elena found herself nodding. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The archive would disapprove. Personal attachments were acceptable for cover maintenance, but genuine emotional connections were discouraged. They created blind spots, weaknesses that could be exploited. FBI Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez stared at the crime scene photos spread across his desk at the Boston field office. Kozlov's death in custody had initially seemed straightforward, a cardiac event in a man with documented heart problems. But something about the case nagged at his instincts, honed by 15 years of investigating organized crime. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too neat. This was the third high-ranking member of Rostov's organization to die of apparently natural causes in the past year. The surveillance footage from the precinct told an incomplete story. The power surge and sprinkler malfunction had created convenient gaps in the timeline, but Rodriguez had noticed something peculiar in the booking footage. The drunk woman brought in that night, Elena Reyes, according to her file, had handled her stiletto heels with unusual grace despite her apparent intoxication. As someone who had worked undercover in his early career, Rodriguez recognized tradecraft when he saw it. "Sir, you need to see this," Agent Sarah Chen said, placing a thick file on his desk. She had been tracking financial patterns linked to Rostov's network, following money through a labyrinth of shell companies and art galleries. 3 months ago, someone started systematically dismantling Rostov's laundering operations. Accounts frozen, transactions flagged, entire shell companies exposed. But here's the strange part. None of it traces back to law enforcement or rival organizations. Rodriguez opened the file, his coffee growing cold as he absorbed the implications. The pattern was sophisticated, showing an intimate knowledge of both banking systems and Rostov's organization. Cross-reference this with any major art transactions in the past 6 months, he instructed. Focus on Russian and Eastern European pieces. His gut told him the art angle was important, though he couldn't yet say why. Agent Chen's analysis revealed something unexpected. A series of high-end art purchases had been made through galleries connected to Rostov's network, each transaction occurring just before a major operation was disrupted. The buyer's name varied, but the pattern was consistent. Someone was using the art world to track Rostov's movements, predicting his organization's activities through their money laundering patterns. There's more, Chen continued, pulling up surveillance photos from various gallery openings. This woman appears at multiple events, always in the background, always with different companions. She pointed to a figure that was just barely visible in several shots, a woman whose face was never quite clear enough for facial recognition software. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a message from his contact at Interpol. The international database had flagged a possible connection between recent events in Boston and an old case from Moscow. 20 years ago, a KGB operative turned chess champion had been killed in his apartment, supposedly by FSB agents hunting a leaked list of deep-cover operatives. The man's daughter had disappeared during the incident, presumed dead until now. The pieces were starting to align, forming a pattern that both intrigued and concerned Rodriguez. He had spent years building a case against Rostov, only to watch key witnesses die or disappear before they could testify. Now someone else was dismantling the organization with surgical precision, using methods that stayed just within legal boundaries, making prosecution nearly impossible. Pull everything we have on Elena Reyes, Rodriguez instructed. Birth records, school transcripts, social media presence. I want to know if her background holds up under scrutiny. He had a hunch that the drunk socialite and the mystery woman from the gallery photos were connected, though proving it would be another matter entirely. Agent Chen returned an hour later with troubling news. Elena Reyes's background was perfect, too perfect. Every document, every record, every digital footprint had been meticulously crafted. To an untrained eye, it would pass any inspection. But Rodriguez had seen enough cover identities to recognize the telltale signs of professional fabrication. Look at the timestamps on her social media posts, Chen pointed out. They follow behavioral psychology patterns exactly. The spacing between posts, the content distribution, even the typing errors. It's like someone programmed a perfect simulation of a real person's online presence. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. They weren't dealing with a typical assassin, or even an intelligence operative. This was something else. Someone with extensive resources, deep knowledge of Rostov's organization, and a personal motivation that made them both effective and unpredictable. We need to move carefully, Rodriguez warned. If this is who I think it is, we're dealing with someone who's been planning this for decades. One wrong move, and we'll lose them completely. He looked at the precinct footage again, watching Elena Reyes stumble convincingly through her booking. For now, we watch and wait. Let's see where this game leads us. Colonel Viktor Rostov sat in his private office at the FSB headquarters in Moscow, studying surveillance photos spread across his antique mahogany desk. The death of Kozlov in Boston police custody had set off alarm bells that couldn't be ignored. The method was too elegant, too precise, reminiscent of operations he had overseen decades ago. In his right hand, he held a white queen chess piece, identical to the one that had disappeared 20 years earlier, along with Mikhail Petrov's daughter. Sir, we've completed the analysis you requested, his aide reported, placing a thick dossier on his desk. The pattern is undeniable. In the past 18 months, we've lost 14 key operatives across 3 continents. All deaths appeared natural, all investigations inconclusive. But when we overlay the incidents with international chess tournament schedules. The aide trailed off as Rostov raised his hand for silence. Rostov opened the dossier, each page confirming what he had already suspected. Someone was systematically dismantling his network using methods that echoed Mikhail Petrov's old playbook. The chess tournament connection was particularly galling. It was exactly the kind of multi-layered strategy that Petrov had favored. Each death corresponded with a major chess event, the locations creating a pattern that only became visible when viewed as moves on a global board. "Show me the Boston surveillance again," Rostov commanded, turning to the wall of monitors in his office. The footage from the police precinct played across multiple screens: the drunk woman's arrest, the power failure, Koslov's death. To an untrained eye, there was nothing to connect these events. But Rostov had spent decades in the intelligence world, and he recognized artistic precision when he saw it. The woman, Elena Reyes, he mused, studying her seemingly uncoordinated movements. Run facial recognition against the Moscow archives, specifically the winter of 2005. That had been the year of Petrov's elimination, and Rostov never forgot a face, especially not the face of a child who had slipped through his grasp. Taking with her a list that could have ended his career, the computer worked silently, comparing angles and features across decades. The results were inconclusive, but Rostov didn't need digital confirmation. He knew in his bones that Elena Petrov had survived, and more importantly, she had learned to play her father's game at a master level. Each apparent coincidence, the power failure, the sprinkler malfunction, the convenient gaps in surveillance, was a deliberately placed piece in a larger strategy. "Contact our assets in Boston," Rostov ordered, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him legendary within the FSB. "I want every gallery opening, every chess club, every high society event monitored. If Elena Reyes appears, she's to be marked but not approached. She'll lead us to her support network." The aide hesitated before speaking. "Sir, there's one more thing. The Museum of Fine Arts is hosting an exhibition of Russian Impressionists next month. The guest list includes several names that match known archive operations patterns." The Archive, a ghost organization that had been a thorn in Rostov's side for years, apparently now protecting Mikhail's daughter. Rostov allowed himself a small smile. The exhibition was exactly the kind of event Elena would use to advance her game. Fine art had always been a favored cover for intelligence operations, and the Russian Impressionist angle was almost too perfect. She was deliberately drawing his attention, inviting him to make the next move. "Book me on the next flight to Boston," he commanded. "It's time to finish what we started 20 years ago." He placed the white queen chess piece carefully on his desk, positioning it in the center of the surveillance photos. The symmetry pleased him. Another game of chess, another Petrov to eliminate, another chance to prove why he had survived so long in a world of shadows. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of his Boston operatives. Elena Reyes had been spotted entering an apartment building in Back Bay, accompanied by a museum curator named David Chen. Rostov's smile widened. She had made the classic mistake of forming emotional attachments. Like her father before her, she had allowed sentiment to create vulnerabilities. "Have our team prepare the usual suite at the Four Seasons," Rostov instructed, "and find out everything there is to know about David Chen. Sometimes the best way to capture a queen is to threaten a pawn." He looked out his office window at the Moscow skyline, remembering another snowy night when he had underestimated a Petrov. That mistake had cost him 20 years of vigilance, watching every shadow for signs of revenge. Elena sensed something was wrong the moment she approached Sarah's brownstone in Beacon Hill. The Sunday morning routine they had maintained for years, tea and chess at precisely 9 a.m., had become sacred to both of them. But today, the curtains weren't drawn back as they should have been. The morning newspaper remained untouched on the front step, its plastic wrapper collecting dew. Every instinct honed by years of training screamed danger. She walked past the house without breaking stride, activating the archive's emergency protocol through a series of seemingly casual movements, adjusting her scarf, checking her phone, fixing her hair. Within seconds, her secure communication device buzzed with thermal imaging data from the archive's surveillance systems. The readings showed multiple heat signatures inside Sarah's house, positioned like professional operators waiting for a target. Elena's mind raced through potential scenarios as she circled the block, her movements disguised as a morning jogger's routine. Sarah had protocols for every type of emergency. They had drilled them countless times during training. The fact that she hadn't activated any of them suggested the attack had come swiftly and professionally. Only someone with intimate knowledge of their procedures could have caught Sarah off guard. The archive's encrypted messages confirmed her worst fears. Similar attacks had been carried out simultaneously at 3 other safe houses across the city. The pattern was unmistakable. Rostov was making his move, and he had inside information. Elena's hands clenched involuntarily as she remembered Sarah's warnings about emotional attachments creating vulnerabilities. Had her relationship with David somehow compromised their security? A delivery van parked across from Sarah's house caught Elena's attention. The driver's posture was too rigid, his movements too precise for a civilian. She recognized FSB tradecraft in the way the vehicle was positioned. Perfect sight lines to all approaches, engine likely still running for quick extraction. They were waiting for her, expecting her to rush in emotionally once she discovered Sarah was compromised. Elena activated her backup communicator, concealed in what appeared to be a fitness tracker. The archive's response was immediate. Satellite imagery showing tactical teams converging on multiple locations across Boston. They had underestimated Rostov's reach. He wasn't just targeting her support network. He was trying to cut off all possible escape routes and safe houses simultaneously. Through her earpiece, disguised as a wireless earbud, Elena heard the archive's tactical channel crackle with updates. 2 more operatives down in Cambridge, another team ambushed in South Boston. The pattern suggested a massive operation, one that must have taken months to coordinate. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Rostov had been playing his own long game, using her successful attacks on his network as cover to identify and target her support structure. A text message from David lit up her phone. He was at the museum, preparing for the upcoming Russian Impressionist exhibition. The normalcy of his message, asking if she'd like to review some newly arrived pieces over lunch, made her blood run cold. If Rostov knew about Sarah, he almost certainly knew about David. Elena started composing a warning message, then stopped herself. Any direct communication would only confirm David's importance to her. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet. Smoke began pouring from Sarah's upper windows. They were destroying evidence, which meant... Elena forced herself to keep walking, maintaining her cover even as her heart tried to break free from her chest. Sarah had always told her that in their line of work, silence meant death. The lack of any distress signal or emergency broadcast could only mean one thing. Elena's training warred with her emotions as she rounded the corner onto the next street. Every instinct screamed at her to go back, to confirm what she already knew, to see Sarah one last time. Instead, she calmly entered a coffee shop, ordered a latte, and activated the archive's scorched earth protocols through a series of precisely timed taps on her phone. Across the city, safe houses would be automatically purged, documents destroyed, covers dismantled. The biggest challenge wasn't maintaining her composure or executing the emergency procedures. It was resisting the urge to rush to David's side. Rostov would expect that. He would have teams in place at the museum watching, waiting for her to make exactly that mistake. Elena took a sip of her latte, her hand steady despite the storm raging inside her. Sarah's voice echoed in her memory. The moment you let them see your pain is the moment you lose. The archive's emergency bunker beneath an abandoned subway station in South Boston hummed with backup generators as Elena prepared for what would likely be her final operation. The space hidden behind decades of city planning mistakes and bureaucratic oversights contained everything she needed for a direct confrontation with Rostov. Sarah had shown her this place during her first year of training, calling it their checkmate contingency, a last resort if all other options were exhausted. Row after row of specialized equipment lined the reinforced concrete walls. Elena moved methodically through the inventory, selecting tools with the precision of a surgeon. Each item had been chosen and positioned according to Sarah's meticulous planning. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She was using her dead mentor's preparations to avenge her death. The weight of Sarah's absence pressed against her chest as she worked, but she channeled the pain into focus, just as she had been taught. Her first priority was establishing a secure monitoring system for David's protection. The Museum of Fine Arts had state-of-the-art security, but Elena knew Rostov's teams would have already compromised it. She deployed a network of micro-cameras disguised as maintenance sensors throughout the museum's ventilation system. The devices, developed by the archive's technical division, would provide real-time surveillance without relying on the building's compromised systems. The upcoming Russian Impressionist exhibition provided both challenge and opportunity. Rostov would expect her to use it as cover for an operation. It was too perfect a scenario to ignore. The guest list included several of his key lieutenants, along with art world figures who served as fronts for his money laundering operations. Elena studied the exhibition layout on a holographic display, marking potential choke points and escape routes. She stripped down and began donning her tactical gear, each piece specially designed for urban infiltration. The base layer contained a mesh of sensors that would monitor her vital signs and relay them to the archive's backup teams. Over this, she wore impact-resistant armor panels that could stop most small arms fire while remaining flexible enough for close-quarter combat. The outer layer was a chameleon fabric that could adjust its color and texture to match surrounding surfaces. While testing her equipment's neural interfaces, Elena's thoughts drifted to the chess games she had played with her father. He had taught her that the key to victory wasn't just planning your moves, but understanding your opponent's psychology. Rostov's attack pattern revealed his weakness. Like many skilled operatives, he had become predictable in his thoroughness. He would expect her to be emotional, to make mistakes driven by grief and anger. She would use that expectation against him. The bunker's communication system crackled with encrypted updates from surviving archive operatives. Rostov's teams were maintaining surveillance on key locations across the city, but their pattern suggested they were stretched thin. Elena marked their positions on a tactical display, watching as their movements revealed gaps in their coverage. These weren't mistakes. Rostov was too experienced for that. He was trying to channel her toward a specific location, most likely the museum. Elena moved to the bunker's armory, selecting weapons with careful consideration. A ceramic composite knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors. A garrote wire disguised as a necklace chain. Small capsules containing various chemical compounds, each designed to appear natural if discovered during an autopsy. Her father had taught her that in chess, each piece had its purpose. The same principle applied to her equipment. Nothing superfluous, everything positioned for maximum effect. The most crucial element of her preparation wasn't physical but psychological. Elena spent an hour in deep meditation, using techniques Sarah had taught her to compartmentalize her emotions. The grief for Sarah, the fear for David, the rage toward Rostov. Each feeling was acknowledged and then carefully stored away. What remained was a cold clarity of purpose, a state of mind her father had called the player's perspective. As she completed her preparations, Elena activated the archive's deadman protocols. If she didn't return to deactivate them within 12 hours, everything she knew about Rostov's organization would be automatically transmitted to law enforcement agencies worldwide. The evidence was comprehensive: financial records, operation details, personnel files, enough to dismantle his entire network. It was her insurance policy, ensuring that even if she failed, Rostov wouldn't survive long to celebrate his victory. The Museum of Fine Arts hummed with the exclusive energy of a private viewing event. Boston's elite mingled among priceless Russian Impressionist paintings, their conversations a gentle murmur beneath classical music. Elena moved through the crowd in a black evening gown that concealed her tactical gear, her movements precise and measured. Through her micro-cameras, she tracked 6 of Rostov's operatives positioned throughout the gallery, all disguised as security or catering staff. David stood near a particularly striking Serov painting, discussing brush techniques with a group of patrons. Elena felt a sharp pang watching him. So innocent, so unaware of the deadly game unfolding around him. Her surveillance showed 2 of Rostov's men keeping him under close observation. They were insurance leverage to keep her from acting too boldly. It was exactly what she had expected from Rostov. He always liked having multiple pressure points. The colonel himself arrived precisely at 8:30 p.m., surrounded by an entourage of apparent art enthusiasts who Elena immediately identified as FSB operators. 20 years had added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, forever assessing threats and advantages. He moved through the gallery like a chess master surveying his board, each position carefully chosen to control the space. Elena maintained her distance, playing the role of an interested patron while systematically executing the first phase of her plan. The champagne being served contained trace amounts of a compound she had introduced earlier. Nothing lethal, but it would slowly affect the balance and reaction time of anyone who drank it. She noticed with satisfaction that most of Rostov's team had already taken glasses, maintaining their covers as guests. The first move came at 9:15 p.m. One of Rostov's men suddenly clutched his earpiece, responding to some unseen alert. Elena had arranged for an archive team to trigger multiple security alarms across the city, forcing Rostov to divide his attention. She watched as he dispatched 3 of his operators to investigate, exactly as she had anticipated. The board was beginning to clear. David's voice carried across the gallery as he began his formal presentation about the exhibition. Elena felt rather than saw Rostov's attention shift to him. The colonel's expression remained pleasant, but she recognized the predatory calculation in his stance. He was wondering if David was part of her operation, weighing the advantages of using him as bait or eliminating him as a liability. Elena chose that moment to make herself visible, deliberately catching Rostov's eye across the room. She raised her champagne glass in a subtle salute, watching understanding flash across his features. The game was entering its final phase, and both players knew their roles. Rostov excused himself from his group and began making his way toward the gallery's private viewing room. Elena followed at a careful distance, noting how his remaining operators moved to cover potential escape routes. The private viewing room contained the exhibition's centerpiece, a recently discovered painting that supposedly depicted a chess match between Russian nobility. Elena had chosen it specifically for this confrontation, appreciating the symmetry. As she entered the room, she noted 4 cameras, 2 ventilation ducts, and 1 concealed door, all factored into her planning. "You've grown to look so much like your father," Rostov said in Russian, his back turned to her as he studied the painting. "He would be proud of your skill, if not your choice of targets." "He would be proud that I learned to play the long game," Elena replied in the same language, positioning herself precisely between him and the door. Her sensors showed his remaining operators taking up positions outside, while the compound in the champagne began to take full effect on those who had drunk it. 20 years, Rostov mused, finally turning to face her. "A remarkable display of patience. But you've made one crucial mistake." He gestured slightly, and Elena heard the gallery door lock click behind her. "You assumed you were the only one playing a long game." The lights flickered, not part of her plan. Elena's tactical display showed new heat signatures appearing in the ventilation system. Rostov had anticipated her surveillance and used it against her, allowing her to focus on his visible operators while positioning a second team out of sight. "Your father died because he forgot that every piece on the board is expendable," Rostov continued, drawing a small remote control from his pocket. "Even the queens." His thumb moved toward the button, and Elena realized with horror that the threat wasn't to her. Somewhere in the gallery, David was in immediate danger. In the split second before Rostov's thumb could press the detonator, Elena made the move that her father had taught her 2 decades ago: sacrifice a piece to win the game. She triggered the EMP device woven into her dress, instantly killing all electronic devices in a 30-foot radius. The gallery plunged into darkness, backup generators struggling to respond. But more importantly, Rostov's detonator was now useless, its circuits fried along with the surveillance systems and locks. The darkness erupted into violence. Rostov's hidden team burst from the ventilation ducts, but Elena was already moving. The chameleon fabric of her tactical gear adjusted instantly to the low light conditions, giving her a crucial advantage. She had trained thousands of hours for close-quarter combat in darkness, while Rostov's men were momentarily disoriented by their night vision equipment failing. Elena moved like a ghost through the chaos, her strikes precise and economical. Sarah's training took over. Target nerve clusters, use opponents' momentum against them, never stay still. The first two attackers went down before they could adjust to the darkness. The third managed to get a hand on her, but Elena turned the grip into a leverage point, sending him crashing into an antique display case. Rostov proved why he had survived decades in the intelligence world. Even without technology, even in near-total darkness, he fought with lethal efficiency. His first strike nearly caught Elena's throat, missing by millimeters as she twisted away. They exchanged blows in the darkness, each trying to end the fight quickly, both recognizing the other's lethal capability. "Your father made the same choice," Rostov gasped between strikes, choosing strangers over family. He was trying to bait her into an emotional response, but Elena had learned from both her mentors. She stayed silent, conserving energy, waiting for the opening she knew would come. Rostov was good, but he was older now, and the champagne's compound was slowly affecting his balance. The opening came when backup power finally engaged, emergency lights flooding the room. Rostov instinctively blinked against the sudden brightness, a quarter second of vulnerability. Elena struck with everything Sarah had taught her, everything her father's death had driven her to learn. The ceramic blade found its mark with surgical precision, slipping between ribs to pierce the heart. "Checkmate," Elena whispered, supporting Rostov's weight as he collapsed. His eyes widened with understanding, perhaps even a hint of respect, before the light faded from them entirely. She lowered him quietly to the floor, arranging his body to look like a natural collapse. The compound in his system would ensure the autopsy revealed nothing suspicious. Outside, she could hear David's voice coordinating the evacuation, staying calm despite the chaos. He was alive, safe. Rostov's hidden team had been neutralized before they could reach him. The archive's backup teams would handle the cleanup, erasing any evidence of what had really happened here tonight. By morning, this would be nothing more than an unfortunate tragedy at a gallery opening. Elena slipped away through the concealed door as security teams rushed in. Her exit route took her past the main gallery, where she allowed herself one last look at David. He was helping an elderly patron remain calm, his natural kindness evident even in crisis. For a moment she considered staying, trying to build a real life with him, but Sarah had been right. In their world, emotional attachments were luxuries they couldn't afford. 3 days later, Elena sat in a cafe in Prague, sipping tea and reading about Rostov's tragic heart attack in the international press. The archive had already confirmed that his entire network was being dismantled, his corrupted FSB allies falling like dominoes as carefully planted evidence came to light. Her father's list, hidden in that chess piece so many years ago, had finally served its purpose. Her secure phone vibrated with a message from the archive. A new identity package was ready, along with a new mission if she chose to accept it. Elena touched the white queen chess piece that hung from her necklace, thinking of all it represented. Her father's sacrifice, Sarah's guidance, the path that had led her here. Across the street, a young girl sat with her father, learning to play chess on a public table. Elena watched them for a moment, remembering similar lessons from what felt like several lifetimes ago. The girl moved her queen aggressively, and Elena smiled, recognizing the same impatience she had once shown. The father gently corrected the move, teaching the importance of patience and position. Elena sent a one-word reply to the archive. Accepted. Some games never truly end. They just evolve into new forms. She had avenged her father and honored Sarah's memory, but there would always be other Rostovs in the world, other wrongs to right. As she stood to leave, she took one last look at the father and daughter playing chess. The girl was learning to protect her king, unaware that sometimes the most powerful piece on the board was willing to sacrifice everything for what really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.